I think the reason for us being able to conduct a reason-based discussion on what kitsch and art is that we both have a clear idea of where we stand, and we do not perceive an objective argument as a personal attack. I think that's a good vantage point for a conversation. Yeah. But I was thinking something that really helped me when it came to the distinction between kitsch and art. I was reading, I don't know if you read Herman Borge. It's not a very diplomatic title. The evil in the value system of art, which is kitsch, then of course, and it uses very religious, very aggressive rhetoric. But the concepts that he introduced really helped me. He talks about the value system of kitsch and the value system of art, because I think, coming from my perspective, there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of figurative painters who sort of hate the modernists, or we are the true artists, and there's a lot of like bitterness or aggression or envy or whatever. But I think if you just sort of step back from that and look at it from above and see, well, this is a system that has those values, and that's a system that has these values, and don't confuse them. I mean, like art critics or art historians do the same thing, right? Criticizing a classical figure painter for not being so-called modern. So I think if we can just, establish what those value systems, the principles of those value systems are, then we can sort of calm things down a bit, and you can get to sort of a live and let live situation. Yeah. But I think when it comes to the value system, if you could start with the value system of art, I don't know what you think, but I think the most important principle, I guess, is that idea of aesthetical indifference.
Yeah, that could be true. I guess the modernist or the modern kind of art value system is basically, or heavily relying on the philosophy of Immanuel Kant as a predecessor. And I guess when Alexander von Baumgarten starts to reinvigorate or establish the concept of the aesthetics in, I think, 1735 or something, I've been trying to look into Larry Scheiner on your request to kind of get a more cultural historical account of how these things developed. So there is the part of this aesthetic disinterestedness, I guess, that we can get from Kant, and there's also this focus, I think, on play and exploration, and I guess in a more abstract sense, just a sort of creative problem solving that could be attained through any particular medium, or in the mix between different media, so to speak.
Well, would you agree then that this is my perception, at least, and I guess it's self-evident, that when you were talking about the value system of art, sort of continuing on what you're saying there, the actual object that you produce, it's not really the important thing. It is part of some kind of research or some kind of exploration, or whatever you want to call it.
In many cases, I think that's true. Just yesterday or something, we had this case where an invisible work of art was sold for 150,000 crowns.
Yeah, and then you get to that point where the idea is the important thing, not the actual object or
so,
what you're looking at.
Yeah. So in that case, that's true. That this is some, I guess, perhaps a logical end or like this logical rabbit hole that you can go into. For me personally, I'm very concerned about the actual objects I create as well, and the imagery and the stories I try to tell. But of course, there is this notion that ideas in themselves and in their reference to a broader or perhaps more precisely a more narrow context in many cases, that you have Duchamp and you have Picasso and you have this kind of the modern masters that did and invented everything, so to speak, in the 20th century, and then everyone that came afterwards has to somehow react to that in a way, and often that results in sorts of, I guess, a paraphrase, and also these references to this information, and this creates like different iterations that are more and more specific. So I guess the problem then is that you end up with a field consisting of just inside jokes, so to speak, and it can fragment, not in a way that you have in the modern art field itself. You have like these different small fields that don't really talk or correspond to each other. So so there I think the kind of the question about values, it's poignant, and it's I think that's something I've been starting to think more about lately as well, to try to kind of at least discover for myself what I'm interested in and what I try to manifest through my work, and somehow I think after conversations with you that there is some sort of overlap, as far as I know, that you and I guess kitsch painters in general are concerned about the idea about universality, for instance, and this empathy and a sort of sentimentality, and I guess the dramaturgical or the drama emerging from like good storytelling. And I guess perhaps the main difference are the parameters or the ways in which we tell stories, and
because I think a fundamental thing is that there was such a funny thing I learned from Boris College. Talks about expressing yourself, and it says, well, that's what you do sitting on the toilet, right? You know? Because like the credo, I think, of kitsch is something that I quoted Andrew Wyeth on several times. That when he talks about that, he wished when he was looking at some motif that he wasn't there. He would just be a pair of eyes looking at this. That it's not him expressing himself, but it's seeing something universal, something which is eternally human, and depicting that, but in a recognizable form. And then, of course, that is a basic tenet in kitsch philosophy, is that it has to be recognizable as nature. But I think that's where you really need to be quite specific, because the cliche, also among figurative painters, I've been there myself, is that you have to do everything exactly correct. You know, like a naturalistic or photographic. Because that's sort of the opposite of the art thing. It's easy to fall into that. Well, they are the bad modernists, and they don't know how to paint. But I'm going to show you, you know, all the hairs on around the eyes. I'll paint them. But then, coming back to that aesthetical indifference, then you, as a figurative painter, would fall into the same trap. Trying to do the opposite, and then you do the same, because you lack that, or you fail to understand that there needs to be this pathos. And I think that is where you have, I think that's the main opposition between the value system of art and kitsch, is that aesthetical indifference and, on the other hand, pathos or sentimentality, which word you want to use. And there's a fun thing. I'll send you the link to a story by Robert McKee on screenwriting. Because, of course, that's music in my ears, at least when you're saying that a story is the same thing as having eternal content. If it's not eternal, it's not a story anymore. It's like, it's either eternal or it's not a story. And of course, that is these things are fused together, right? So if you have sentimentality, that's not just something you want in itself, but it comes out of telling a story that is logically consistent, and you see the reaction between these figures in the painting, hopefully if it's composition, right? And that's where I've thought a lot about that because it's sort of going on a little detour here, but as a classical figurative painter, it's been typical to that they draw the Nazi card because Hitler liked the figurative painting, blah blah.
Yeah.
And I look at it, and I have 2 big volumes with so-called Nazi art, which just figurative paintings that was made at the time. Sometimes they just call it German landscape to be able to come into an exhibition, right?
Yeah.
And but with this, the figures that are sitting there in these sort of famous examples that they use, their expressions are totally blank. There's no pathos there. There's no drama. There's no action. There's no character. There's nothing going on. And I think I don't know what you think about that, but I cannot see that as an element within the value system of art. I mean, you can talk about some kind of transitional period, and I guess would you describe yourself more like a modernist in the sense that you are concerned with the actual object that you make?
Yeah.
Whereas the sort of the pure conceptualist is more of a later development. You're sort of
definitely.
You're sort of a conservative.
That's kind of funny because at my art school, I've been called a cliché artist in the way that I like to make actual paintings or actual sculptures and like to
you
create
work
things,
over a period of time with that.
and I have been very interested in, I guess, both schools of the German expressionists, for instance, where they infused their artistic endeavors with this concept of the universal and also with spirituality. I think from a lot of them were influenced by Blavatsky, who was a mystic.
Yeah, Madame Blavatsky.
Danger.
This is getting far.
No, but I like this kind of idea and reaction I got from trying to communicate through your art and not being in this kind of self-insulated conceptual sphere where you only create internal or inside references that become, in a sense, their own currency and their own point of departure from with the whole concept of taste from Pierre Bourdieu, for instance, where you use language or art to distinguish yourself from other people.
Like a uniform.
And in a sense you become better, or you get more cultural capital than the common man, so to speak. And I think this is part of the kernel of what I'd call the kind of image problem of or public relations problem of modern art, if you want to call it that way, because a lot of people at my school, for instance, they are very, in a sense, left-leaning and with this classical idea of the working class and their interest and economic differences. And
so like they're on their side.
But of course the working class are turning against the modern artist now with the squandering ombudsman who was here. A lot of the people in his comments and following his page are representatives of the working class. And of course a lot of the artists, and especially I guess stage-based art, they really hate those kind of, I guess, what they'd call banal critiques. You just don't understand. And this is where this internal field of just references and contextual ideas that are self-insulated becomes just a sort of an alienating thing that removes this part that I think we are both interested in, regardless of how we produce or how we express the point of storytelling and communication. Or I was talking to Sebastian Salvo late yesterday, and he thought about the word like religion, which according to him is a combination of ligar and re, which means putting things back together or something. And it seems to me in Kitsch as well that you try to create some sort of unity in both in storytelling and the internal composition of the picture, like the formal elements, but also the informal kind of the actual emotional reactions you want to create, or perhaps more specifically the that the picture is charged with some sort of story that is possible to react emotionally to, and this could be kind of construed a lot, at least at the academy or the art school where I go now, that this is kind of outdated and old and banal.
Yeah, and I think from a Kitsch perspective, that's what I see as a weakness then with the value system of art.
Yes,
is that you undercut that basic human need for seeing your life reflected in an eternal perspective. I think that's a basic idea that people need, and that's why from a Kitsch perspective, this whole idea of originality is completely not absurd, but not a question, because it's a matter of how well do you tell the story. So that per definition excludes the idea of originality from that field when that is the goal. If you want to create a story that has this archetypical content, then originality just makes it difficult for the audience to connect to it. And if there is some kind of a so-called originality, I hadn't seen that before, suddenly you see some aspect of life that you hadn't thought about, then that is not something completely foreign to you.
No,
it's just something you hadn't thought about, but it strikes you because it is something that is already internal in you somehow. Right? So I mean, but that's interesting too. That that's maybe already like 15, maybe 20 years ago. I read an interview with a professor of art theory. Very renowned. He'd been a director of the Astor Museum of Modern Art, so he's very high up. And he just blankly stated that originality is not a thing anymore. And that was interesting, because I've been thinking about the same thing, that as far as I can see, within art, it's out of originality, because that sounds like you're an individual, and you don't want to say, I'm doing whatever everyone else are doing, right? But originality, aesthetical indifference, and being of your time. I think being of your time and aesthetical indifference are perhaps the most central values.
Well,
because again, that is a thing about, okay, how does it differ from Kitsch? Well, there you have sentimentality and not being of the time, right? So it's quite clear difference.
I see your point, and it just makes me think that perhaps I'm not that modern after all, because I can see the appeal of somehow polishing the zeitgeist, so to speak, like the time in which you are creating stuff related to what is immediately kind of the cultural context around you, being in your time. But I'd never trade that away for being like in this universal time, so to speak. So if you are going to, I think most of the modern art that is successful and still is in its time carries an aspect of the universal still.
Well, that's the thing. You have, what was that? That was at that museum, modern museum, French painter. Anyway, modernist. But he had painted something very abstract, but you could see there was some kind of a horse there, or whatever. And I thought, well, actually, Bork says it. No art can survive without a drop of kitsch. That's his words. Because, there's something there recognizable. There's a horse. There's some kind of story going on. So people naturally search for that, or try to find that. Right?
And they search for what they already know, so to speak. It's, and I think that's completely natural. And I've been thinking about kind of what are the things that makes art or kitsch or like any kind of aesthetic experience come alive. Like what, for instance, what happens in the brain. I tried to do some research on that. I'm not a brain scientist, obviously, but I
but you're a brainy guy.
was very interested in the work of I think he's an Indian neurologist that was working with brain damaged patients. And he somehow it occurred to him that well, perhaps I can use these kind of different brain structures and damages and like really rare kind of brain diseases that gives certain very specific syndromes. Like, for instance, with one sort of brain damage, you everything is normal, but when you see your own mother, you immediately think that she's an imposter. She's not real. She's just someone pretending to be your mother. And that's the only affliction that happens with this particular thing. And this guy, I think his name is Vilyanur Ramachandran, he tried to then extrapolate and investigate further, like, so how can this happen? How can it be so specific and isolated, and just this one aspect of reality is so fundamentally changed when everything else is still the same? And so his point was that somehow a lot of, I think regardless of modern or kitsch type of art, I think that every successful form of like aesthetic experience somehow or often overstimulates, in a sense, certain parts of your brain, or make your brain communicate differently with itself. For instance, he was talking about an ornithologist, a guy that was studying birds, and he was studying the nest of a seagull, and the fledglings, or like the children, so to speak, in the nest. They don't recognize the seagull, their mother, through the shape of the seagull. Like when we, if I was asked to draw a seagull now, I'd probably throw up the contour, like the shape. But of course, the fledglings, they only recognize their mother based on one red dot on the beak. And that red dot is the entire world. So when they see that red dot, they immediately open their mouth and start to call for food. So this ornithologist tried to check this out. So when the seagull left the nest, he'd take a long stick and just paint a red dot. And of course they thought it was their mother. Yeah. But the interesting point here for Ramachandran, when was by some kind of accident or just some kind of playfulness, this ornithologist, he erased the red dot and he made a red ring instead, and then presented it to them. And then they got another kind of reaction, and then, okay, maybe if I just make 3 red rings for some reason, I don't know why, I don't think he knew as well, I think he just experimented. Suddenly, he provoked a reaction from the fledglings that when presented with both the stick and the seagull mother, they'd rather have the stick. And this is what I think he called the peak shift principle, that art has this fundamental way of charging and overstimulating your brain to such a degree that you could even look past your own basic needs, or you can be tricked in a sense.
Thank you for checking out this clip from the Cave of Apelles. If you want to watch the entire segment, head over to caveofapelles.com/donate and become a $5 patron. That will allow you to access all our Dark Flame episodes, bonus material with our featured guests, and more.